It's good to have you all here. I'd say see you all here, but I can't necessarily see that far. It's my great pleasure to have here with us Herbert Ogden, who is, started out as a history teacher and then became a lawyer and has served on a number of school boards. And in the process, it is that experience, he tells me, which led him to get interested in or have strong feelings about the issue of public money going to religious schools. And it's so I'll let him tell you more about that. But Herb, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And I was not only a history teacher, I was also a German teacher. And if you transition from teaching, some of you have already heard this, if you transition from teaching German to practicing law, you just change the foreign language that you operate in. I had an ancestor who's probably going to be turning over in his grave somewhere during this because he was a Episcopal priest in New Jersey who wrote a screed called Thomas Jefferson, the Deist Unmasked. And of course, I'm going to be talking about Jefferson and the wall of separation between church and state. Evidently, even though he wrote Thomas Jefferson, the Deist Unmasked, my great-great-great-great-grandfather was not conservative enough because he was supposed to be the next bishop of New Jersey, and they decided he didn't quite fill the bill and he never made it. Okay, let me give you a little history here and show you why I think that the hair on fire approach to this problem is not the right one, aside from the fact I have no hair to be on fire. And a lot of you know this already, I'm sure, but the whole controversy comes from the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which, among other things, has freedom of religion. What you have to bear in mind is that this originally applied only to the federal government. It wasn't until the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868 that there was the possibility that maybe it was going to apply to the states. And I'll just read you the first section of the 14th Amendment. Only a little bit of it applies, and I'll try to boldface it. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, and here comes the part that applies to us, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. Well, this due process clause of the 14th Amendment fairly soon became the subject of some scrutiny. Well, what does it mean for a state to deprive a citizen of life, liberty, or property without due process of law? What was liberty? What was due process? And there still is a debate about whether the 14th Amendment actually gave anybody rights they didn't have before. And opinions have ranged on the Supreme Court from the flat no, it didn't change a thing, to, oh yeah, it made it impossible for states to do any of the things the federal government wasn't allowed to do under the Bill of Rights. And the way the Supreme Court has handled this is that rather than find that the due process clause incorporates all of the Bill of Rights, it's supported selectively incorporating those rights that the court finds are essential to due process. And unfortunately, from time to time, the courts have thought different things were these rights that were so essential to due process. The process of, shall we say, incorporating the Bill of Rights into protections against state action, actions by states, probably began back in 1897. There was a case called the Chicago, Burlington, Quincy Railroad versus the City of Chicago. And there the Supreme Court appeared to require some kind of just compensation for property that the state or the local authorities condemned. Evidently, that was not some guarantee in the Illinois Constitution, so they had to look to the federal Constitution. The Supreme Court clearly began this in 1925, where it explicitly said that the states were bound to protect freedom of speech. Not every state protected the freedom of speech in its Constitution. Ever since then, the court has steadily incorporated most of the significant parts of the Bill of Rights, namely said that a state cannot do these various things that the federal government isn't allowed to do either. There are a few that it hasn't, where it hasn't addressed. They include the Fifth Amendment right to an indictment by a grand jury, and the Seventh Amendment right to a jury trial in civil lawsuits. By and large, it has. Well, let's get to religion here. The first significant decision that said that the states couldn't do regarding religion what the federal government couldn't do came in 1940, and it had to do with, I think they were Jehovah's Witnesses who were going from place to place in Connecticut doing what Jehovah's Witnesses do, and they were prosecuted under a state statute regarding religious solicitation. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, that is infringing on freedom of religion. You should be able to go and knock on people's doors. You can't barge in, but you can knock on their doors, and if they want to listen to you, that's just fine. You can't be prosecuted for it. Then, in 1947, there was a case. It's kind of funny because the way the case actually came out was that there was not a problem with free expression. There was a New Jersey law that authorized local school boards to pay the cost of transportation to and from schools, and this included private schools. And of the private schools that benefited from this, something like 96% were parochial Catholic schools. So the statute was challenged on the ground that it interfered with the separation of church and state. And the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the statute because reimbursements were offered to all students, regardless of which religion they were, and also because the payments were made to the parents. They weren't made directly to the various schools. But the Supreme Court majority also wrote now, it's a long thing, but I'm going to quote it because it may give you some idea how far away from that we've gotten recently. The Establishment of Religion clause of the First Amendment means at least this: neither a state nor the federal government can set up a church. Neither can pass laws which aid one religion, aid all religions, or prefer one religion over another. Neither can force or influence a person to go to or remain away from church against his will, or force him to profess a belief or disbelief in any religion. No person can be punished for entertaining or professing religious beliefs or disbeliefs, for church attendance or non-attendance. And then, no tax in any amount, large or small, can be levied to support any religious activities or institutions, whatever they may be called and whatever form they may adopt to teach or practice religion. And that's going to apply to what's happening here in Vermont in just a minute. Neither a state nor the federal government can openly or secretly participate in the affairs of any religious organizations or groups, and vice versa. In the words of Jefferson, here's where my ancestor's going to turn over, the clause against establishment of religion by law was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state. The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. That was followed up in 1962, and I see some of you are as old as I am, so you probably had to say the Lord's Prayer in school. There was a New York law that required public schools to open each day with the Pledge of Allegiance and a non-denominational prayer in which students recognized their dependence upon God. The law did allow students to absent themselves if they found this objectionable, but this ceremony had to happen every day. And a parent sued on behalf of his child, arguing that the law violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, as made applicable to the states through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, and won. And then for quite a while, the U.S. Supreme Court followed a test. I guess it's important what case it came out of. There was a Rhode Island statute that allowed the superintendents of public schools to reimburse private schools for the salaries of teachers who taught from public textbooks with public instructional materials. The idea being they were using the same books as teachers in public schools were, so why shouldn't we subsidize the private schools to have these teachers? And the U.S. Supreme Court voted, I think it was 8-1. No, this was unconstitutional because they said, number one, a statute's got to have a secular legislative purpose. You can't have a religious purpose behind the statute. Two, the principal effect must neither advance nor inhibit religion. It's got to be neutral regarding religion. And this is the hardest one to figure out. The statute must not result in an excessive government entanglement with religion. There can be some entanglement, just not excessive. And the factors you were supposed to use to figure out whether the entanglement was excessive as well, what's the character and the purpose of the institution? What's the nature of the aid the state provides? What's the relationship that results between the government and whatever religion you're dealing with? This was used pretty much from 1971 up until only last year. And last year, a case that probably a number of you are aware of, a case out of Washington State, there was a high school football coach in Bremerton, Washington, who prayed at the middle of the field immediately after each game. Remember that one? And pretty soon, players and others joined in. The school board was concerned this would be seen as endorsing what he was doing and infringing on the Establishment Clause. They tried to negotiate with him to pray elsewhere or different at time, but he continued on doing this. His contract wasn't renewed. He sued the board. The lower courts agreed with the school board, applying that test I just told you. But the U.S. Supreme Court majority said the Establishment Clause does not allow a government body to take a hostile view of religion in considering personal rights. The other thing that the U.S. Supreme Court did that only I guess a lawyer would appreciate, I don't know if there's any lawyers in the audience here. I was hoping my friend Lon McClintock was going to show up. Anyway, the U.S. Supreme Court cherry-picked the facts. And some of you may recall last year when you read about this, it looked like the way the coach was handling it would have made it somewhat difficult for players on his team not to participate in this thing. But that's not in the facts that the U.S. Supreme Court cited. It's in the facts that the dissent cited, but not the majority. So they made it look like, okay, here's this guy all by himself doing this, and some people joined in, but nobody felt really encouraged to. So they said that the board acted improperly in not renewing his contract. Well, there are three decisions beginning in 2017 that led to a problem we have here in Vermont. And the first, appropriately, is called Trinity Lutheran Church of Columbia versus Comer. It was about a Missouri program that offered grants to qualifying nonprofit institutions to install cushioning playground surfaces made from recycled rubber tires. Well, the Missouri Department of Natural Resources said that you couldn't apply for a grant for this playground surface if you were controlled by a church, a sect, or some other religious entity. So, the Trinity Lutheran Church Child Learning Center applied for a grant. It was denied on the grounds that the playground was operated by a church. U.S. Supreme Court said, we deem it unremarkable in light of our previous decisions to conclude that the Free Exercise Clause did not permit Missouri to expressly discriminate against otherwise eligible recipients. While it was true that Trinity Lutheran remained free to continue operating as a church, under Missouri law, it could enjoy that freedom only, quote, at the cost of automatic and absolute exclusion from the benefits of a public program for which the center was otherwise fully qualified. So the mere fact that a church owned the playground did not disqualify it from getting government help to put the bouncy stuff on the playground. That was sort of the camel's nose under the tent. Then in 2020, there was a case out of Montana. Now, the Montana Constitution barred government aid to any school controlled in whole or in part by any church, sect, or denomination. But Montana gave essentially vouchers to parents who wanted to send their kids to private schools if they weren't religious, if the schools weren't run by a religion. And the U.S. Supreme Court said a state doesn't need to subsidize private education, but once it decides to do that, it can't disqualify some schools just because they're owned by a religion. Now, what that left people not knowing was, well, what happens if you're not only owned by a religion, but you also instruct in that religion? Because the decision I just mentioned out of Montana didn't involve whether the recipient of the public money was using it to subsidize religious instruction or whether the school just happened to be owned by a religion. Well, that question was answered last June in a case out of the state of Maine. Maine had a system that was a good deal like what Vermont has. If a school district didn't have a public school, in this case it was high school, I think it was high school, it doesn't really make any difference, the state would pay tuition to a private school as long as the private school didn't use the money for religious instruction. And a couple of families who wanted to send their kids to schools that did use or would have used the money for religious instruction sued. The lower courts said, that's not a problem. It's a proper separation of church and state. Maine doesn't have to pay. In fact, one of the decisions was by a court of appeals on which former Justice Souter sat. But it got to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they decided 6-3 that this was infringing on freedom of religion. And what they said was Maine's tuition assistance program, like the program in Trinity Lutheran, the one about the playground, effectively penalizes the free exercise of religion. The state pays tuition for certain students at private schools as long as the schools are not religious. This is discrimination against religion, they said. A state's anti-establishment interest does not justify enactments that exclude some members of the community from an otherwise generally available public benefit because of their religious exercise. And they said, well, while the wording of the Montana statute and the Maine statute isn't exactly the same, the effect was the same to disqualify some private schools from funding solely because they're religious. And they said if you're going to have a law like that, it has to pass the strictest scrutiny. And to do that, the government had to show interests of the highest order, and the statute had to be narrowly tailored to fit those interests, and the Maine statute flunked. And they also said a law that targets religious conduct for distinctive treatment will survive strict scrutiny only in rare cases. So what they've done a little less than a year ago was to say basically that a state can violate the free exercise clause of the First Amendment just by subsidizing certain things. It has nothing to do with a law prohibiting you from going to the temple, going to church, whatever it is. It's that if you're going to give money, you have to give it to everybody. A really novel approach. You know, And I should add, by the way, that I'm speaking only for myself. My school board has not taken a position on this. They don't want to take a position on this, as far as I can tell. I don't particularly blame them, but I have a position. What the U.S. Supreme Court seems to be doing is saying that the free exercise clause extends so far that it involves helping me through money send my kids or myself, I guess, to whatever religious institution I want to. I'm a little surprised that the U.S. Supreme Court did that, even though the applicants in the main case were fundamentalist, well, fairly fundamentalist Christian schools, because of course what this did is it's opened the door to any religion having a fundamentalist school that gets public support. These people could have been asking for money for a ultra-Orthodox yeshiva. They could have been asking it for an ultra-Orthodox Muslim madrasa. Could have been any kind of a school, as long as they met the minimum state standards. You had to teach English, math, and so on. But that's the state of the law. And they went on to say, well, the Maine had attempted to defend what it was doing by saying, well, all we're really doing is giving the kids that don't have a public high school in their district the rough equivalent of a public school education. And I have to agree with the U.S. Supreme Court on this one. They said, and I'll quote, the difference says between private schools eligible to receive tuition assistance under Maine's program and a Maine public school are numerous and important. To start with, private schools do not have to accept all students, while public schools generally do. In addition, the free public education in Maine insists it is provided that Maine insists it's providing through the tuition assistance program is often not free, as some participating private schools charge several times the maximum benefit that Maine gives. Because what Maine was doing was it was paying, I don't know how they figured out the amount, but it was clearly a lot less than a lot of private school tuition was. And of course, in Maine, you can go to public school without having to pay any tuition, so that was a difference. And the curriculum taught at participating private schools need not even resemble that taught in the Maine public schools. And they also noticed that Maine private schools didn't have to hire state-certified teachers. So the idea that all Maine was doing was using this money to kind of help out the kids in sparsely populated rural areas and give them roughly the same thing they would have been getting at public high schools, they said, no, that doesn't really, facts don't support that. And I have to say they're probably right. And then they said, well, the state retains a number of options. It could expand the reach of its public school system. It could increase the availability of transportation. It could provide some coordination, some combination of tutoring, remote learning, and partial attendance. Could even operate boarding schools of its own. And they said, as we held in Espinoza, that's the Montana case, a state need not subsidize private education, but once a state decides to do so, it cannot disqualify some private schools solely because they're religious. Now, there was a dissent by the three remaining more or less liberal justices. This was written by Justice Breyer. And I'm going to quote him at length because I sympathize with a lot of what he said. He spoke of the increased risk of religiously based social conflict when government promotes religion in its private school system. Prayer and Bible reading in the public schools during and as part of the curricular day involving young impressionable children whose school attendance is statutorily compelled can, he said, give rise to these very divisive influences and inhibitions of freedom which both religious clauses of the First Amendment sought to prevent. He said, the potential for religious strife is still with us. We are today, he said, a nation with well over 100 different religious groups, from Free Will Baptist to African Methodist, Buddhist to Humanist. He quoted Pew Research Center about that. People in our country, he said, adhere to a vast array of beliefs, ideals, and philosophies, and with greater religious diversity comes greater risk of religiously based strife, conflict, and social division. He said the religion clauses were written in part to help avoid that disunion. As Thomas Jefferson, one of the leading drafters and proponents of these clauses, wrote, to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves is sinful and tyrannical. And as James Madison, another drafter and proponent, said, compelled taxpayer sponsorship of religion, quote, is itself a signal of persecution, which will, he said, destroy that moderation and harmony which the forbearance of our laws to intermeddle with religion has produced among its several sects. But that was only 3 justices, and the other 6 said, no, Maine cannot do that. All right, what's the situation in Vermont? The Vermont Constitution, Article 3, has a thing called the compelled support clause, but, and this gets back to my hair not on fire comment, it's helpful to see it in the context, because the context is a lot more approving of religion than just the compelled support clause is. It's not that simple. Here's Article 3 of the Vermont Constitution. I think this is pretty much the same way it was when it was passed in 1777. That all persons have a natural and unalienable right to worship Almighty God according to the dictates of their own consciences and understandings, as in their opinion shall be regulated by the word of God, and that no person ought to or of right can be compelled to attend any religious worship or erect or support any place of worship or maintain any minister contrary to the dictates of conscience, nor can any person be justly deprived or abridged of any civil right as a citizen on account of religious sentiments or peculiar mode of religious worship, and that no authority can or ought to be vested in or assumed by any power whatsoever that shall in any case interfere with or in any manner control the rights of conscience in the free exercise of religious worship. Nevertheless, every sect or denomination of Christians ought to observe the Sabbath or Lord's Day and keep up some sort of religious worship, which to them shall seem most agreeable to the revealed will of God. So the assumption here seems to be that everybody is a Christian. The only question is, can one bunch of Christians force another bunch of Christians to do what the other bunch of Christians doesn't want to do? And the answer is no. And you can't make them pay for it either. Well, in 1999, there was a case in which the Chittenden School District up my way, north of Rutland, was paying money to a parochial school. And the Vermont Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. Districts that tuition students to religious schools have to ensure that there are adequate safeguards against the use of such funds for religious worship. Unfortunately, our Vermont Supreme Court never said what those adequate safeguards were. Some of you may know that a number of school districts thought they had figured out adequate safeguards, as did our district. This way, you sent out a questionnaire to the school, the religious school that the parents wanted the kids to attend, and you said, how much of your curriculum is religious? And if the answer was 30%, then you paid 30% of whatever you normally, you paid 70% of whatever you normally would have paid. You deducted the remaining 30. And that was very, very briefly a policy of the Vermont Agency of Education, but they got rid of it almost immediately. Meanwhile, the Secretary of Education and a bunch of school districts up in Chittenden and Franklin counties, and I think Grand Isle County, had been sued for not paying money to religious schools. And by the way, religious schools could have 2 meanings. What I'm going to be using here is a school that uses money to have religious instruction, not just a school that's owned by the Episcopal Church or something like that. And while that suit was still going on, along comes the U.S. Supreme Court in this case from last June. And in my opinion, the Agency of Education and their lawyers just rolled over at that point and played dead. They said, okay, all right, we'll settle the case. We won't tell these districts that they can't pay money to the religious schools, And the religious schools, the school districts agree they'll pay money to the religious schools. And the Secretary of Education will send a letter advising all school districts that they should pay money to religious schools as long as they qualify. Otherwise, they have to have some kind of a curriculum and so on. And this case was in federal court. The parties, on one hand the parents, on the other hand the school districts and the Secretary of Education, also wanted the judge to say that the Vermont Constitution and the U.S. Constitution conflicted, and that the reason basically for the settlement was that the U.S. Constitution obviously would be superior to the Vermont Constitution, and the implication was, well, this is the way it had to be. It got to federal judge Christina Rice, who, bless her heart, said, wait a minute here. I can't say that the Vermont Constitution violates the U.S. Constitution just because you say it does. If you really want me to decide that, I'm going to have to do it on the merits, and you haven't given me the facts that and the law I need to decide it, so I'm not going to do that. So there has been no decision. Now to my way of thinking, there isn't any conflict here. What happened is that when Carson versus Macon, this case out of Maine, came along, it drastically reduced the area we have to deal with as local school boards. Because now if we send money to a qualifying religious school, if we send money to a qualifying non-public school, we've got to send it to a non-qualifying public school that uses the money for religion. Well, there's two ways out of that. One is to stop paying public money to non-public schools, because as long as you're doing that, then what happened in Maine is irrelevant. The U.S. Supreme Court was at pains to say that the Maine case applied only if you gave public money to non-public schools. The other way it could be handled is by somehow changing the character of at least some of the schools that are currently non-public in Vermont so they be public in the eyes of the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's why I quoted that long thing about the Maine schools didn't have to follow the same curriculum, didn't have to have certified teachers, so on and so forth. You can still read newspaper accounts and things on Vermont Digger and whatnot that occasionally seem to get this wrong. They say, well, no, the constitutions conflict. And if you're ever discussing this with somebody, here's a simple example that may help out. Assume there's a federal law that says public schools have to offer free breakfast to students, but it can't include a vegetarian option, maybe because the beef producers had a good lobby in Congress, okay? So let's say there's a law that says you got to offer, if you offer free breakfast, you can't have a vegetarian option, all right? Assume there's a state law that says all schools have to offer a free meat option and a vegetarian option. How do you handle that? Well, one way to obey both laws is just not to offer any free breakfast. Another way would be to charge for breakfast. That's not saying the laws are in conflict, it's just really reduced the freedom of action that you have in order to obey both of them. So here's our problem in the Taconic and Green Regional School District, which is Weston, Londonderry, Peru, Landgrove, Mount Tabor, where I live, Danby, Dorset, Manchester, and Sunderland. 85% of our kids, as of the last reported figures, go to Burton Academy in Manchester, which is a non-public school. Another 6% go to Long Trail School in Dorset, which is also a non-public school. So there's 91% of your kids. The percent that currently attend a public school is, I think, around 3%. There's a mixture of other kids that get tuitioned off to Vermont Academy and Saxon's River and a bunch of other private schools. It's impractical for us to stop paying money to Burton Academy because 85% of our high schoolers go there. That's 600 and some odd kids. Even if our neighboring public high schools wanted to accept these kids, there's not room for them there. You can't suddenly send 600 kids 300 north and 300 south. And furthermore, state law doesn't oblige public high schools outside our district to take the kids anyway. They have a perfect right to say no. They don't even have to demonstrate they're full. They can just say, no, sorry, this is not in our scheme here. And so far, the approach of the Agency of Education seems to be to hope that the religious schools that are currently getting our money are going to violate state anti-discrimination statutes. And next time they come up for approval, they won't be approved on account of that. And no district can pay tuition to an unapproved school. Well, that would solve the problem, but I think it's the wrong approach for three reasons. Again, I emphasize this is just my thinking. It's not my school board's thinking. They don't have to have a position on this one. First, a school like Grace Christian here in Bennington may decide it's going to comply with the anti-discrimination laws, and therefore it would continue to be state approved. And I can see a way that a school like that could do it. They could say, we as a school teach that, let's say, same-sex marriage is bad. However, if you are a homosexual teacher, we will nevertheless hire you. We're not going to discriminate against you. We're just going to say that what you're doing is bad. Of course, as a practical matter, unless they're really hard up, which gay person is going to apply for a job at that school? But they would have obeyed the statute. So there's one problem. Second is that we have a really murky school approval process right now that, among other things, says that once a school's been approved, it stays approved until the approval period expires and the State Board of Ed decides not to reapprove it. Well, in the case of Grace Christian, for example, their approval ran out last year. I think it was year before last. And they made a timely application for a new approval, and the state board still hasn't acted on it, so they're still approved. You could theoretically stay approved for 10 years while the state board decides what to do about it. So there's a couple of problems with it there. A particular problem for a school board member, and I would say for a legislator, because they take the same oath of office, is that we take an oath that you will not directly or indirectly do any act or thing injurious to the Constitution or government of the state of Vermont. Well, how can a school board member facilitate sending public money to a religious school and not do something injurious to the Constitution of the state of Vermont when our Vermont Supreme Court has said you can't use public money for religious instruction? How could a legislator vote in favor of something like that? They take the same oath. The third thing is that schools that have a religious curriculum may be getting ready to try to persuade federal courts that our state anti-discrimination laws and rules also violate the Free Exercise Clause. And this is mainly on account of something called the ministerial exception, which doesn't have a lot to do with Reverend Barbara, luckily. But what it is, it began as a fairly straightforward idea that states couldn't regulate employment of ministers, for example, the way they could regulate employment of church sextons or retail clerks or anybody else, because you couldn't, if a religion said, for example, we don't ordain women, a woman who wanted to be ordained in that church couldn't go to a court and say, make the church ordain me. That's a fairly simple example. What's happened to that statute, that principle, though, is it's been, in my mind, grossly misapplied. And now it's been used in some courts to say that as long as a religious school employee has some religious role, almost no matter how small, they fall under the ministerial exception. They qualify essentially as a minister. So, for example, I think this was a case out of Illinois a couple of years ago. There was, I think she was gay, with some protected category, who was fired for being whatever it was, I believe it was gay, went to court because this violated anti-discrimination law, and the answer was no, because one of your duties, I think, was to spend, I think it was half an hour a day supervising some sort of a devotional exercise. You're a minister, and since you're a minister, you're not protected. Well, I can easily see if the state of Vermont or a local school district tried to enforce state anti-discrimination statutes against a school that was run by a religion that said, for example, gay marriage is bad and we're not going to employ any married gays, the answer would be, well, all our employees have to spend half an hour a day or half an hour a week even supervising some sort of devotional exercise. They qualify as ministers and therefore they're exempt. I don't think this is going to happen, but it could even take another turn. I wouldn't be surprised, I don't think this is going to succeed, I wouldn't be too surprised, but what some parents, aided by a thing called the Alliance for Freedom, which is a very deceptively named outfit that is basically trying to get religion into public schools, could say, if I'm not allowed to send tax money to a religious school of my choice, that violates my First Amendment rights, even if I'm in a public school district that has its own school. I don't think that's going to happen, but with our current Supreme Court, I wouldn't want to bet that it doesn't either. So there's a number of pitfalls out there. So in Vermont, what are our limited options? Now, of course, for a lot of places, this is sort of academic because most places in Vermont have public school districts with public schools, and therefore what happened in Maine doesn't apply. But we do have a number of districts that don't. We have a number of districts like mine where there's been a private academy that's functioned as the public high school for, in some cases, a couple of centuries. People don't even necessarily notice that it isn't a public high school. And because of that, there's no realistic alternative. The same thing is true, for example, in St. Johnsbury. St. Johnsbury Academy. St. Johnsbury has no public high school. I don't know where you put all those kids if suddenly St. J Academy couldn't receive any public money. So the simple option of saying, okay, we're not going to pay public money to these currently non-public schools, kind of a non-starter. It sounds like, well, okay, you've got to violate your oath of office. There's a constitutional law professor up at the law school in Royalton that had talked with me some about this and agrees there is an alternative. And he says, I've come to think that there may be another less drastic option available, one that will allow school boards from sending towns to continue to enlist some independent schools in providing public education in Vermont without violating either the free exercise clause of the U.S. Constitution or the compelled support clause of the Vermont Constitution. He says, the approach I want to suggest and the advice I think the Agency of Education should be giving local school districts is actually spelled out in existing legislation. And then he goes on to say there's a title, there's a statute in Title 16 of Vermont statutes, which is the one that deals with education, Section 827, that allows school boards to designate up to 3, I'm quoting here, approved independent schools or public high schools, end quote, as, quote, the public high school of the district. And therefore, they would be eligible for publicly funded tuition support. Maine, by the way, didn't have a provision like that. There was no, this is called designation. Maine statute doesn't provide for a designation. It just said that the money would go to basically whatever independent school the parents identified. Now, this is not exactly a magic solution, Because say we in, in my school district were to designate, I'll make up a school, the Mountain Free Academy, as our public high school, and it was a Christian school, and we didn't put any requirements on it, I think if that got to the court would say, wait a minute here, what you've done is just like saying salt is henceforth pepper. It's the same thing as it was before, you just gave it a different name, and it probably wouldn't work. We'd probably have to put on some conditions that made it behave a lot like a public high school. You probably would have to have the same teacher certification requirements. You would probably have to have the same curriculum. You would probably have to have the same hours, the same truancy provisions, and so on. The one interesting thing that you probably wouldn't have to have is that it probably wouldn't have to be run by a public school board. Because think about charter schools in other states. They aren't run by public school boards either, and yet they qualify as public. Now, whether that's a good idea, I'm not going to take a stand on. I mean, it's a little insulting to us local school boards to say, well, schools are better if you guys don't run them. But evidently, that's part of the magic of charter schools. And Professor Teachout went on and suggested a bunch of criteria that a school board should use in deciding who to designate. What's the track record of the school? Does it meet the basic requirements for special education? Do its policies comply with anti-discrimination laws? Are its staff entitled to all the regular constitutional provisions that we get around this problem of the ministerial exception? Well, at least he thought it would, but maybe not. And I would probably add, there's something here about geography too, because you couldn't very well designate a school that was a lot harder to get to than a more nearby school if what they offered was about the same. That wouldn't make any sense. The Vermont chapter of the ACLU took a stand on, their staff lawyer took a stand on this, and he said, for a number of reasons, including equity and a commitment to making public education truly a common benefit, our long-term recommendation is to move to a regime where public funds flow only to public schools. But then he said, that said, we fully understand that such a change would not be easy. And this is him talking to Professor Teachout, the constitutional law professor. I think your proposal is a potentially elegant and effective solution in the interim, one that merits serious consideration as an immediate path forward with greater anti-discrimination enforcement. One other thing I should mention, and I'll be happy to take questions for however long, there's another case going, still active now. The one I described earlier has been settled. The judge refused to say whether the statute's conflicted. Nobody objected to that, which is kind of interesting because normally if a case is settled through stipulation, the judge does everything the stipulation asks the judge to order. Yes, so-and-so has to tear down their garage, have to do it by January. They can't build their driveway across your land, and they agree they're going to pay you $50,000 for having put ruts in your front lawn. Well, what the judge did in this case is she looked at the party's stipulation, the one that's asked her to say that the Vermont Constitution was violating the federal Constitution, and she rewrote it. She just took out that part. After she warned them she wasn't going to sign it, and they sent her back the same thing again anyway. I've never seen a judge rewrite what's called a stipulation, but nobody objected, so she got away with it. More power to her. But the other case is an interesting one. It's called Vitale versus Vermont, and this is a case brought by a bunch of parents in a district like here that does have its own public high school, and they're arguing that there's a benefit enjoyed by parents and kids in towns that don't have their designated public high school because they get to send their money wherever they want to, and how come we can't? And I have to admit there's some logic to that, if it really is a benefit. It started out, I think, not as a benefit. It was just, well, this particular town never had the money to build a high school. There was a nice academy in the next town. Let's send our kids there. But if you look at real estate ads in our area, it's touted as a benefit that you have school choice. And there's in my mind, there's two things the Vermont Supreme Court could do in that case. And in oral argument, which happened back in November, one of our justices suggested, well, isn't the simple answer that we stop sending public money to non-public schools? That takes away all, nobody has a benefit. Of course, the plaintiff's argument was, no, that's not what we meant. We want everybody to have this benefit. Well, think about what that would do to public education in the state of Vermont. But that one's still out there. And it'll be a while before it's settled, because what's in front of the Vermont Supreme Court right now is kind of a procedural matter. And I think regardless of what the Vermont Supreme Court does, the case is going to come back again, and then they'll have to decide, is this really a benefit? And if it is, what do we do about it? There was a bill introduced just last week, Senate Bill 66, which attempted to fix this by requiring school districts to designate up to 3 schools. And it gave some criteria for how you could decide which 3 schools, one of which was basically, were they state chartered schools? That goes back to the times when every corporation in the state of Vermont had to be chartered by the legislature. There was no automatic way you did it. And I'm not sure whether that really has anything to do with religion or education. And in my mind, the criteria are a little strange. And like many bills, it'll probably change before it goes anywhere. But so the legislature's trying to do something about it. In my mind, they haven't really fixed the problem, but I keep telling members of my school board, before you criticize it, come up with something better. So, that's the current situation. And again, because this is required, I want to emphasize these are just my views. They're not the views of my school board. They don't have any view. So here's our situation. What do we do in Vermont with the districts that don't have their own public high school? How do we keep these kids in school without paying money to schools that our Vermont Supreme Court has said you can't pay public money to? Thank you very much.